So what it's saying is that it's just saying touch all the other ones, right?
I think we are supposed to touch this one.
Yes,
We are
do.
supposed to touch that
Not
one,
Just
I
this one.
believe.
And remember to keep it off while you're making.
Good morning. If you could take your seats, please. Thank you. My name is Matthew Hyman. I am the chair of the International and National Security Law Practice Group at the Federalist Society. I'm also on the leadership team at the National Security Institute at the Scalia Law School at George Mason University. And on behalf of both organizations, I'm delighted to introduce today's Symposium, Next Generation National Security. Just a couple of housekeeping notes, and then I'll turn it over to the moderator for our first panel. I think everyone's familiar with the work of the Federalist Society. With regard to the National Security Institute, it is an organization within the law school at George Mason University, as I mentioned. It has two primary missions. The first is it leads all of the national security academic programming and teaching for the law school. And the second mission is it acts as a policy organization that focuses on finding practical solutions to tough national security questions. And it does that through a volunteer network of national security experts that have had tenure in both the public and private sector. Many of our network experts have spent significant time in both realms. And both organizations, both the practice group and NSI, do programming like this throughout the year. So if you're interested in the work of either organization, please come see me during the course of today's symposium, or check in with the Federalist Society folks or the National Security Institute folks that are sitting at a table sort of midway back of the room. They'll wave their hands, and there they are. So if you're interested in that group's work, please check in with them. I want to thank you all for being here in person. This is the first time that we've had a National Security Symposium since 2019, and it's wonderful to do these live with real faces in the room. So thank you for coming out. For those of you on the live stream, thank you for tuning in. I'm sure today will be an interesting conversation on both topics. In terms of the schedule, our first panel, which will focus on cryptocurrency, will run about 2 minutes from now up until noon. We'll have a break from noon to 1:30. If you're here in the room, lunch will be provided, but there'll be no programming during that time. So if you want to leave or come back, you're free to do so. Our second panel will start promptly at 1:30, and the focus of that discussion, as reflected in your program, will be AI and national security. The other housekeeping note that I want to make sure everyone's aware of is if you're here in the room and you're seeking CLE credit, you should have programs in front of you, and those programs should have a QR code that looks like the QR code on that poster board. Depending on which bar you are a member of, you need to check in, and you most likely need to check out. So do both if you want CLE credit. If you don't care about CLE credit, you don't have to do any of this. And then the last thing to note, just as a courtesy to our speakers, please silence whatever devices you have in your pockets or bags that make noise. Thank you. And with that, I'm going to introduce our moderator for our first panel. That's Eric Cadell. Eric is a partner at Sullivan & Cromwell. He serves as the co-head of the firm's economic sanctions and financial crime, international trade, and investment practices. He also serves on the executive committee of the Federalist Society's International and National Security Law Practice Group. And with that, I'll turn it over to Eric.
Great. Thank you very much, Matthew, and welcome to all of you here today. It's great to see everybody's face in person, as Matthew said. We have the pleasure of introducing for you today the first panel in the series today. We're going to be talking about cryptocurrency and the potential national security risks and benefits that it potentially may present. You've heard a little bit about me from Matthew. Why don't I just jump in with an introduction of our panelists. And we are privileged to be joined by 4 panelists today. The fourth, you see an empty chair for right now. We're crossing our fingers. We think he's in traffic and should be here any moment, but we'll go ahead and carry on. To my right, your left, Gus Coldebella, who's currently a partner at True Ventures, a venture capital firm based in California, and Gus is in Boston, focused on early stage technology investing. And Gus previously served as general counsel at two crypto-focused businesses, Paradigm, the investment firm, and Circle, the issuer of the USDC stablecoin, as well as the top lawyer at the U.S. Department of Homeland Security under Secretary Michael Chertoff. Immediately to my right is Bill Hughes, the senior counsel and director of global regulatory matters at Consensus. Bill formerly worked in the White House, the Department of Justice, and going way back in time with me at Sullivan and Cromwell as a young lawyer. So we're happy to reconnect today.
Which of you is the young lawyer?
That's Bill. To my immediate left is Una McDonald, international expert in financial regulation. She has advised regulatory authorities in a wide range of countries and formerly served in, among other capacities, as a British Member of Parliament, a board member of the Financial Services Authority, and in a variety of private sector roles. Una recently released an excellent book entitled Cryptocurrencies, Money, Trust, and Regulation, and I recommend that enthusiastically for further reading on the issues that we'll talk about today. And then finally, to the furthest on my left is the Honorable Juan Zarate, Global Co-Managing Partner and Chief Strategy Officer at K2 Integrity, and whom many of you likely remember from his prior service at the U.S. Department of the Treasury. In addition to Una's book, I recommend to you Juan's book, entitled Treasury's War, The Unleashing of a New Era of Financial Warfare, not on cryptocurrencies specifically, but more generally, a really good primer and resource for thinking about how governments think about financial crime and means of stopping that through sanctions and other measures. Panelists, before we jump into the meat of our discussion today, maybe I could just ask you to give the audience a minute or two on how did you become interested in cryptocurrencies? What is your role with them? How do you engage with them in your day-to-day? And I'll start with you guys.
Thanks, Eric. Thank you. And before we begin, thanks again to the Federalist Society and to NSI for sponsoring this great event. I'm proudly a member of both organizations, though I think before the panel ends, Dean will probably tell me that I owe dues for this year. Eric mentioned that I was general counsel at DHS during the Bush administration, and during that time, I became deeply interested in those areas where there's sort of a collision between private sector new technologies, national security issues, and older or outdated regulatory schemes. And we dealt with a lot of those during the Bush administration. Obviously, cybersecurity needed to be scrutinized, and we did a lot of work in that area at DHS, especially during the end of the Bush administration. Encryption technology, sharing of travel data. After I left the administration and went back into private practice, did a lot of work in those areas, but this was when cryptocurrency came on the scene. Bitcoin was really invented in 2008. And we're talking about the time between 2009 and the present. And I started getting a lot of questions from clients who were interested in engaging with this new technology, either by trading it, buying it, starting an exchange, developing technology to implement it. And the main question was, well, what regulatory schemes in the United States apply and how? And immediately after jumping in, I found the answer at that time, and it's not too different now, is, well, we don't know yet. It's developing. And that was a signal to me that this was an area that, instead of giving advice on well-worn rules to clients. You could actually explore a new space, and in something that's a real joy for a lawyer, you could help the development of wise regulation in the United States. So that was my first introduction to crypto.
Great. Bill, how about you?
It was 2017. I had heard of Bitcoin before, but when I started sort of exposing myself to it in earnest, I realized that it was actually an invention. It solved a very long-standing problem of computer science, and for that reason was very exciting because it could do things. It created a network that could do things that has never been possible in human history. And it took, I'm not a computer scientist. I can use my iPhone, that's about it. But it occurred to me, thinking about how transformational the internet was, that introducing a brand new invention that allowed people who don't know each other and have zero reason to trust each other to all agree to the same facts and all take concerted action, that was like a fundamental shift in what was possible. And so that was a pretty romantic thought. I kept, in my spare time, because everybody has a day job, nobody just poof, they're in cryptocurrency. I kept up with it. I voraciously learned about it. And so when I was ending my tour of duty in the Justice Department, the question was, what do I do next? No offense to the law firm's lawyers here, but the thought of going back to a law firm didn't move me. And I really thought, I remember it clear as day. I was sitting on the couch reading an old Wired magazine article about the Silk Road, the investigation and eventual arrest. And it occurred to me that it was 10:30 at night. I was reading this stuff out of interest because it really excited me, and that it was a whole burgeoning field. Like Gus said, the path is being determined about the capability of this technology and actually what it's good for. All of that stuff's being written, and the rules and laws and regs and standards around it are being written. So to be part of something like that, to participate in it in some modest way, is incredibly exciting and incredibly rewarding. My job now is to serve as a lawyer and also sort of a liaison between DC and the company Consensus Software. Our CEO and founder was one of the founders of Ethereum. And our biggest product is MetaMask, which is the most popular wallet, crypto wallet in the world. And our biggest service is Infura, through which most people around the world actually read and write to the Ethereum blockchain. So our mission is to make programmable blockchains a rich and growing environment, in addition to providing tools for both users and developers. That has a lot of implications on the legal side, and I get to be up to my neck in all of it, and so it's fantastic. So I'm looking forward to this discussion today, and thank you to the Federalist Society. I paid my dues last night. I paid my dues.
And don't forget the Scalia School of Law, too. Thanks, Bill. And I think the lawyers in the room will at least take a little bit of consolation, even though you didn't want to return to the law firm life. You're still a counsel. You haven't quite given up the law practice yet.
It was close.
All right. Well, thanks very much. Una, how about yourself?
I think rather a different process for me. I'm not a lawyer. But although, of course, I was formerly a member of Parliament, so used to reading and understanding and applying laws and then financial regulation ever since. I had just finished writing a book about LIBOR manipulation and what had been done to end the ability to manipulate, foreign exchange, and the manipulation of the gold and silver market. So then Bitcoin and blockchain appears on the scene to my scene. I hadn't been paying much attention before, and this was allegedly a means whereby so much manipulation could be ended. And I got fascinated by the technology, acquired a technology advisor, and really got to grips with understanding the technology lying behind Bitcoin, and then began to think about money. And that's why one of the key words in the title of my book is trust. And we've just heard about trusting people that you don't know across the globe, and I thought, not so sure about that. Is this really possible? And on what basis can I trust them? And should I trust them? So that's one of the questions behind my discussions of Bitcoin, and then on to stable coins, and then on to central bank digital currency. What should we do with this notion of a currency that exists solely on the internet? What I find curious and interesting is that all the advertisements for Bitcoin and other stable coins all have this lovely picture of a gold coin with a bee on it. Why is that? Well, it's obviously a selling point, because if you just put the string of numbers on, I don't think many people would actually rush to buy it at all. But you depict it as a coin, and I've even had people asking me, if I do this, do I get a coin? No, you don't. You don't get anything at all, except for numbers, which rather puts people off, as I said. But I wanted to dig into the technology. Can this technology be used to advantage elsewhere? Yes, I think it can. Can we really develop a currency? Well, you can wait for that until we start the discussions in the panel, and I'll have more to say about that then.
Great. And Juan, how about yourself?
Eric, good to see you. Thank you to everybody for being here, and to the Federalist Society and NSI for inviting me to be on this illustrious panel. I apologize for walking in a little bit late. We were very punctual here. So thank you. I spent my career post 9/11 at the Treasury Department, then at the White House, worrying about a whole range of transnational threats and actors. One of the things we did at the Treasury Department was to worry about how America's enemies raised and moved money around the world. And our strategies were, in essence, driven by the mantra of making it harder, costlier, and riskier for America's enemies to raise and move money around the world. We did that with terrorists, proliferators. We tried to do it with nation states, rogue actors. In that context, we looked at the way that actors related to each other financially, what assets they used. And certainly in my 4 years at the Treasury Department and then 4 years at the White House, we saw the precursors of digital assets. Certainly there's precursors to Bitcoin and e-gold and other kinds of assets. So we were keeping a very close eye on how bad actors were trying to evade sanctions, evade anti-money laundering controls, and how they would try to get access to capital that they would otherwise not be able to get access to. And so when I left the White House in 2009, sort of kept watching the field, wrote about it actually in Treasury's War. It's at the very tail end. The last chapter is called The Coming Financial Wars, and I do mention the rise of digital currencies and the potential for digital currencies to serve as an alternate platform for rogue actors to access capital. At the time, Bitcoin was $15. I wish I had bought a lot of Bitcoin at the time. Even at today's numbers, it would have been worth it. So I was watching it sort of in terms of strategy and policy. I then was exposed to the market. In 2013, began a conversation with Brian Armstrong and Fred Ursum, the co-founders of Coinbase, who had just started their idea. And I was fascinated by the notion that you could imagine sort of an ecosystem evolving with key institutions, what has eventually evolved into virtual asset service providers, sort of clearinghouses or exchanges, and really an interesting question as to whether or not you could manage the risks of bad actors misusing crypto, but also potentially thinking about the opportunities around financial autonomy, inclusion, greater transparency, greater ability to circumvent the control of autocratic states that were trying to gain access to people's accounts and economies. And so I became an advisor to Coinbase in 2014, the first independent advisor. I think they liked me because I could talk to them about sort of the AML regulations and sanctions issues, but it quickly became a fascination of mine in terms of how the market was evolving. Fast forward to today, we work with a range of crypto clients, DeFi platforms, Web 3.0 aspirants in the space, to think through and to do exactly what Gus described, which is to actually think about what the regulatory and policy environment should be, and how to shape it, and how to shape it for good, and how to think about this as a technology that's an asset as opposed to a vulnerability. And so that's been my journey in this space.
Great. Well, thank you all very much. I think now everyone out there, you've heard a little bit about us and what background we bring to the conversation. So for those of you here in the room and those of you who are following along at home on our webcast, or maybe even for those of you who tune in down the line in a recorded version of this panel, let me just give you an overview of what we intend to cover today and how we plan to go about things. What we are really trying to do, we hope that our panel today will give you an answer or at least valuable insight into the question, what is cryptocurrency and why should I care? There's different variations. I think we probably all have some level of familiarity, but as Bill said in his remarks, he had to dig in and spend a lot of time educating himself about it because there's a lot of different facets to the general topic. So we'll talk a little bit about that. And then what we're really going to focus on is, once we establish sort of the baseline understanding, is some of the national security challenges and benefits that cryptocurrency may present, and sort of why do we think it may be good or bad for policy reasons. We'll have a true panel discussion. I will have a question for, we'll start with one of the panelists, but we'll sort of jump in. Please do hold your questions. We are going to take questions at the end. We'll leave about 15 minutes for questions. So hold them, write them down, keep them in your mind, and we will be happy to talk about them as we get to the end of our discussion. So with that, let me jump in on the first question, and we're going to start with a table setting question, if you don't mind. As I said before, I think most people have a basic understanding of what is cryptocurrency. Some of you probably have a lot of understanding, some have less. Let me just take a show of hands. How many feel like you know a lot about what cryptocurrency is? So, about, I'd say about a quarter of the room feels like they have a great understanding. How many feel like they have sort of a basic understanding but need to know more? And that's probably closer to 2/3 of the room. The other, the remainder, I guess you're somewhere in the middle. But in any event, you've heard the term. There's articles about it all the time. The press is covering it. You heard an opinion piece in the Wall Street Journal today talking about how you should not believe that Bitcoin is dead. It's been moving in cycles, although the current thinking is that Bitcoin is in a death spiral. That's all hype and expected to come back. You can see articles like this all the time. You see commercials at the Super Bowl everywhere. But what is it actually? How is it created? What are the differences among different types of cryptocurrency, and so on? So I think we'll start with Bill. And Bill, maybe you can give us a little bit of a background here. I understand this is a really big topic, but get us started off, please.
I'll try to do this as efficiently as possible, and so please pick up any pieces I leave behind. So cryptocurrencies are digital assets that exist on peer-to-peer computer networks that are secured by public-private key cryptography. And so really the important thing is the network. It's just you understand basically the concept of a network. It's lots of computers all running the same software, talking to each other, and basically maintaining the same data set. Now they're each maintaining a copy of that same data set, and the changes to it they all have to agree to, and the data set they process transactions in batches, and anybody with the right equipment can be a node on this network, and anybody with the right software can access this network to read to it or write to it. So said simply, think of the Bitcoin network as just this big spreadsheet, copies of which are stored on computers around the globe. The spreadsheet operates and is updated according to a set of rules that are expressed in computer logic that is essentially the code. And anybody with the right software can read this spreadsheet. Anybody with the right software and who pays their way can transact on this spreadsheet. And the invention was that all these different nodes, without knowing who the other nodes are, can agree as to the state of the data, what the spreadsheet looks like right now, and what transactions are processed, and the state of the network after those transactions are processed. That's actually a pretty simple way to explain it, as trying to be as accurate as possible. But not all cryptocurrency. So cryptocurrency is the native token to that network. It only exists on that network, and it has utility on that network. To execute a transaction, you must pay the network some of this native token for the network to process your transaction and add whatever you want to do to the data structure. If you are doing the work of supporting the network, securing and processing transactions, the network will reward you by giving you some of the token. And you get a little slice of whatever the person who's actually trying to get something transacted pays. But not all these networks have the same functionality. Bitcoin is actually pretty simple. Its simplicity is elegant. There are lots of good reasons for it to be simple, because it's more secure, more reliable. Other networks offer different features. Some offer privacy features. Bitcoin's not anonymous. We can get into that later, I'm sure. But a network like Ethereum or other programmable blockchain networks, not only is it a spreadsheet, but it allows anybody operating by the right rules, running the right code, to actually upload computer software, computer code to the blockchain itself, which, if coded in such manner, can be accessed and used by anyone else on the network to make their on-chain transactions, the transactions that this computer network is processing for them, more complex. And so basically, it's a computing platform. Ethereum is a computing platform. Other programmable blockchains are computing platforms. And so to the extent Bitcoin has a dollar value, or Ethereum has a dollar value, or a value in any other thing external to that network, is because people have created mechanisms through which you can exchange one unit from that computer network for some other unit existing elsewhere. And so if tomorrow people stopped caring about converting Bitcoins into dollars or buying Bitcoin with dollars, then Bitcoin's dollar price would go to zero. Would it still have value in the Bitcoin network to the extent people still wanted to use the Bitcoin network? Yes. If you wanted to process something on the Bitcoin network, it would still have value in that space. So I'll end with this and then turn it over so people can fill in all the spots. Well, one more thing. The networks are resilient, meaning that the network itself polices who gets to join, because you got to play by the rules. If you don't play by the rules, you're either sloppy or you're malicious. You try to attack the network cuts you out. If nodes are compromised in one country, say the United States, say China, decides, we don't like this network, let's take over all the computer nodes in our jurisdiction and use those nodes to try to undermine the network or change the network in some fundamental respect. If they don't have enough nodes, the network will kick them out. So it's very resilient and it's very secure. The type of cryptography used ensures that any transactions that were previously done can't be undone. And it's also secure. Anybody operating on the network does not have to ask permission for anybody. So this is where I think the national security implications sort of bubble up from. If you have the right equipment, you have an internet connection, you have enough energy, and you have some basic know-how, which then that bar is getting lower and lower as the tech gets easier to use, anyone in the world can access this network. Anyone in this world can transact with anyone else in this world as long as they're running the same code. And there is nothing the United States or any other country can do about it without essentially taking over the network. And for the truly decentralized ones like Bitcoin and Ethereum, that's essentially, by my judgment and the judgment of others, is virtually impossible right now. So this is the reality that we have to get used to. What did I miss?
Great, thanks, Bill. Una, it looked like you were ready to jump in there, so why don't I let you jump in?
Yes, I will. I will jump in. The way in which this was set up, it was actually using older technology, existing technology put together by Satoshi in order to establish Bitcoin. There are problems with Bitcoin itself. It is slow because it takes a long time for the proof of work, about 5 to 10 minutes, to actually exchange a coin. Now, what you will read is that this involves confirming a transaction involves a complicated mathematical problem. It took me some time to figure it out. No, it doesn't. It works like this. Satoshi originally thought that you would be able to create Bitcoin on your laptop or desktop. But it quickly moved beyond that to require larger and larger computers, because what you're actually doing, it works much more like a slot machine in that you have to guess the series of numbers and you have to keep banging away until you get the right series of numbers. It is not a complex problem. It is simply requiring that. That, of course, means, and if you look at the moves from one type of computer to another, you are moving to larger and larger and more powerful computers in order to complete the transactions. At one point, though this has changed, China was willing to use a large number of computers, the nodes, but of course the nodes were concentrated and there were occasions on which it would have been possible, given that all the Chinese nodes, and they're often owned by one or two companies, colluded with each other and could command 51% or over 51% of the transactions taking place. So not quite as secure. It is pseudonymous, I can never say that word, not anonymous. And that is because you have to have the private and public key. But that in turn depends on how you set it up on your computer and whether or not your IP address is, whether or not you use your normal IP address or have a range of IP addresses or use IP addresses that you obtain from some other source. And then you can discover the money laundering type transactions. My understanding is that it takes time to do so because you can read all the transactions, but you don't know who actually sourced those transactions until you have the IP address, which leads you to the private key. So that is the way in which it can actually function, and that is why it can be used for money laundering and terrorist financing. And that's one of the problems with it. The other problem is, of course, is the unfortunate people who lose their private keys. Why on earth they don't write it down and lock it in a safe, I do not know. True. But one Irish gentleman, I regret to say being Irish, put it with his fishing equipment. And the landlord from whom he rented the cottage for fishing chucked it out, couldn't find it in the landfill. But since he was a drug dealer, I don't shed many tears for him. But I do shed them for the Irish government because it couldn't reclaim the 48 million or whatever it was that should have gone into the pockets of the Irish government. So if you do engage in Bitcoin, do what I said, write it down, lock it in your safe, because you won't remember that long string of numbers.
Eric, could I just add something here? What's really interesting as well in terms of the network and the federation that Bill described is crypto is one form of a token that can run on those rails. A lot of innovations happening in the space on top of what else can run on those rails. So for example, on the Ethereum chain, you can run smart contracts. So you think about how to actually create more efficient ways of doing things like trade finance or even government procurement. So it's important to think about the technology and the rails themselves as enabling a whole range of things, not only the trading of Bitcoin or Litecoin or other kinds of cryptocurrencies as we think of them. A second point, and this is really important as we think about the regulatory environment and the maturity of the space, not all crypto's the same, right? So Bitcoin's different from Ethereum, it's different from Litecoin, it's different from Monero. Some are privacy coins intended to be more anonymous than others. Not all stable coins are the same, as we've seen the market reaction to Terra USD, which is in essence collapsed, whereas USDC has remained stable. Not all virtual asset service providers are the same. The US-based ones tend to be more compliant. They have compliance teams in place. They actually worry about money laundering risks, whereas others that are offshore don't. And not all jurisdictions regulate the same. They're just like in the tax context. You have some jurisdictions that are better at regulating, some that are, in essence, allowing sort of an open playing space for these actors. A final point, the crypto evangelists, you talk to the Michael Saylors of the world who've really sort of staked their identity and their company's value on these things, talk about this in transformational terms, right? This is a technology. It's not just another interesting little asset class or a technology to play with. This is actually another form of property. It's decentralized. It allows for financial autonomy. He talks about it as digital energy, and you talk to other crypto enthusiasts, they talk about this as the next evolution of the internet. If you think about how you monetize the ability of computers to network and talk to each other and validate. So there's different ways of thinking about the technology, but the real sort of crypto evangelists think of this as transformational in terms of how the financial system itself operates, and not just as a sort of a pet project to run on your laptop.
Great. I know Gus wants to jump in with a thought. I also want to just ask our panelists. We've talked, thrown out a couple of terms. A stable coin. Maybe we could just, Gus, if you want to just say what that is exactly. And we've also talked about the mining process and creating the Bitcoin. And maybe we could say a little bit more about that too. But first, over to Gus.
Thanks, Eric. And I think my co-panelists did a great job of taking us through the basics of blockchain and crypto. I just want to pull out very quickly 2 or 3 themes that I think you've heard during this discussion. One is decentralization. I think each of us said that. Another is permissionlessness. And the third is, and I think I might be adding this, transparency. Okay? And just a few words on each one of those things. What those crypto evangelists that Juan described, the reason that they like decentralization is because it takes out the middleman. I mean, if you think about Facebook, for example, or banks, Transactions on Facebook, that is, you're posting something, it's on your feed, other people are seeing it, all go through a central hub. You have to trust that central hub to actually do what you want them to do with it. You don't own it once you post it, and it is censorable. Same with the bank. If you're doing transactions through Venmo or PayPal, you are trusting a centralized authority to affect the exchange that you want affected through those sort of private rails. And Una made a point that Bitcoin is relatively slow compared to these sorts of transfers. And the reason it's relatively slow is because it values decentralization over speed. That is, if I wanted to send Juan a Bitcoin, there is no central authority through whom the Bitcoin transfer has to go. The computer miracle that Bill described is eliminating that central authority from the transaction. And that's one of the reasons that this is an exciting technology. Bill also talked about permissionlessness, which means anyone who has the code can jump in and start interacting with one of these blockchain networks. The third theme, which I think is very interesting, is transparency. Bill described the Ethereum network as being, Bitcoin is a network that allows the transfer of value and does one thing very well. Ethereum takes some of the innovations of Bitcoin and allows you to run computer code on it. So it's described by some as a world computer. But in order to have that code being run on nodes across the globe in the resilient way that we described, the code has to be available to everyone. So there's a strong open source culture in crypto. And as a user of crypto, you are, with the right amount of sophistication or through reliance on someone else who has the right amount of sophistication, you're able to look at the code and say, do I trust this to interact with? Or is it something that I shouldn't trust? So I think pulling out those themes will be important for our conversation because they both provide the advantages of crypto, but I think you could see for each of those three, they also lead to some national security questions that I think we have to grapple with as policymakers or policy-interested people. And Eric also asked about stablecoins. So going back a few steps, one of the interesting things about the cryptocurrencies that we've talked about, like Bitcoin or Ethereum, is that the price fluctuates based on a multitude of factors. Bill described that, what's the real purpose of these things? It's essentially to pay rent. It's to buy a ticket. Because what is a blockchain? It is, well, okay, I'll say it. It's a chain of blocks. But essentially, each transaction on a blockchain goes into one of these blocks. And if the network is really popular at a particular time, the laws of supply and demand dictate that it costs more to get in that block, right? So the price of that commodity goes up. As a result of that, you see sometimes wild price swings in the assets that are used to pay that rent, like Ethereum and Bitcoin. And several companies, including the company that I used to be the general counsel of, Circle, saw a need for all of those advantages of crypto, that is instantaneous settlement and transparency and sort of always on and permissionlessness, without the fluctuation of price. Because, gosh, it would be hard to negotiate the sale of a car to be delivered next week when Bitcoin was $60,000 a Bitcoin, and then have it settled when it was $20,000 a Bitcoin. So from that, a particular type of stablecoin, which is what we call a dollar-backed stablecoin, was developed. That is, through a web portal, you can, through your bank or through a credit card, go to Coinbase and say, here's $100, and Coinbase will give you 100 USDC or US dollar coins. At any time, you can go back to Coinbase and turn in your 100 USDC and get those dollars back. And in the interim, what happens with those $100 that you put in, or currently I don't know who has the number, $50 billion that are in the system, they're in a bank account. And they're in short-term, low-risk instruments that allow the issuer of that particular stablecoin to have easy, instant access to it when redemptions are necessary. What Juan talked about was a different kind of stablecoin, which is called an algorithmic stablecoin. And this is at the edge of computer science, and as a lawyer, I'm definitely going to step in it as I try to describe this. But what the developers of this type of technology tried to get out was, listen, we want this to be completely crypto native. And what does that mean? That means USDC has 1 foot in the traditional finance world and 1 foot in the crypto world. The traditional finance world is, we've got a bank account. It's spinning off interest. That's where we keep the money that you gave us in exchange for the USDC. And what these computer scientists have tried to solve, sometimes successfully and frequently in terrible failures, is a way that through the use of multiple tokens, the price of one token essentially maps $1. The news that you read about people's savings being wiped out from this Terra Luna stablecoin is one of the reasons, and I know I'm jumping ahead now, that I think we're going to see much greater attention on the regulation of algorithmic stablecoins than we do in the regulation, which will also come of dollar-backed stablecoins. And I'll leave it at that, Eric.
Yeah, great. Una, I know there was one last point you wanted to make before we move on to the next major question.
Right. Well, I better make a couple of points about stablecoins first, and issues of transparency and also issues of decentralization. First of all, yes, stablecoins were the result of the high level of volatility of Bitcoin and people looking to an alternative by backing it very often with a fiat currency meant to be backed directly or algorithmically, and that is a complex issue, of course. But let me go on to a couple of points about transparency, because I think the discussion of transparency so far has been in the wrong place. That as regards stablecoins, what transparency do you really need? Well, and this will also relate to the issue of decentralization. What do you really need? This is what I would like to see on any website by any of the major stable coins, and I'm going to take Tether as an example, deliberately. Tether is, in fact, headquartered in the British Virgin Islands. As a company, I cannot find that it is actually registered with the Financial Regulatory Authority in the British Virgin Islands there, despite inquiries through a law firm located there. Just as a matter of interest, but maybe not directly, most of you won't know what a Crown dependency is. It's a UK Crown dependency with its own governance, just removed, and it's now under direct rule by the UK government because of the extensive corruption and with the Prime Minister, allegedly, of course, and with the Assembly. So lots of court cases going on there. Tether has always claimed to have sufficient in reserve. So these are things that I want to see on a website as the selling of Tether. I want to know where its location is. I want to know who the directors and officers are. I want to know how to contact them. I want to know how much can I redeem, when, and under what regulations. I want to see all the financial statements, including a profit loss account, And I certainly want more than an attestation that the reserves are sufficient to cover the withdrawals of my tether. So that, of course, goes to the issue of decentralization, as well as to the issues of transparency. As you can see, I'm locating transparency from the point of view of the potential purchaser of a stable coin and the potential user of it. Oh, and what I also want to see is how much is it going to cost me. I have a tough notion of stablecoin. I regard them as parasites on fiat currencies. So that's a thought that you can explore for yourselves. Why do I worry about decentralization? Well, I'm, as you probably gathered, a skeptical kind of person. And I looked at the announcement made by the CEO of Binance, which is one of the largest exchanges in the world. And a couple of years ago, he says, we're an internet company. We're everywhere. I get that point. That sounds very reasonable. He said, so we don't need a headquarters. Why don't you need a headquarters? Because you're not in any jurisdiction and you are not under anybody's rules, because as yet we do not have global rules, though we have some pretty good attempts, and we'll come back to that later. So that's my notion. Interestingly enough, the CEO of Binance is clever enough to, the wind is blowing towards regulation. He's here looking at the European Union in particular, so I will locate a headquarters within the European Union. The exact location is not finalized yet. And so transparency has to lead to accountability. I'm giving you my money. I want to know what you're going to do with it and how much it will cost me.
Great. Hopefully that served as a pretty good cryptocurrency 101 and 102 for anyone out there who needed some background. There's still a lot more to say about it, obviously, but I think what I'd like to turn to quickly, and then we can get into a couple more direct national security questions, is why do we care about cryptocurrency? What is it? We know what it is. We've heard the different forms that it can take and the themes of concern potentially and benefit potentially. But why do we care from a policy standpoint? Gus, let me start with you on that.
Thanks, Eric. And it's the reason we should be focused on this is not because Elon tells you to buy Dogecoin on Saturday Night Live. Even though, I'll tell you that the level of public interest in cryptocurrency and its permeation into popular culture is actually part of the reason that we here in this room should be focused on it. I'll give you 3 or 4 quick reasons, Eric. I think the first one is just what I said. There is a massive amount of interest and growing interest in cryptocurrency in the United States and across the world. Some surveys have as many as 13 to 14% of U.S. persons saying that they own some cryptocurrency and have interacted with these networks before. That skews very young. If you look at millennials and Gen Z, some of these surveys have people responding that they don't plan to ever really have a bank account, but they do have crypto accounts. And they use the product that Bill talked about before, MetaMask or another crypto wallet, to interact with other people who are on these networks. And it's not just users. I mean, as a technology investor, and by the way, when you said at least you didn't leave the law, I felt like you might have been focusing on me. You never really leave the law. But I mean, my job at True Ventures, which is an early stage venture capital fund, is, in addition to investing, it's helping our portfolio companies, especially those in regulatorily interesting areas like crypto, to navigate the environment and to come here to DC and to to help our policymakers sort of understand how the innovators in the United States are thinking about this. But in this space, what we're seeing is a massive influx of brilliant engineers and other technologists from FANG companies to crypto companies. If you ask any hiring and HR person at the FANG companies, they see this trend happening. And we see a lot of entrepreneurs, a lot of founders coming up with very, very interesting ideas in this space. And obviously, given what I do, we have a lot of investors investing. Now, by and large, these are not people who want to engage in Ponzi schemes or sanctions evasion or terrorist finance or ransomware. These people want to take those qualities that we were all describing before of decentralization and permissionlessness and transparency and build new things. Replace some of the ways that centralized finance or centralized other institutions have gone wrong, have sort of owned your data rather than you owning your data. They want to build a new financial system that's transparent and decentralized. And that's really linked to the second point. With all of this interest and adoption, one of the reasons that I think we have to focus on this area is that we in the United States may be losing the initiative on having this important tech developed here. And there are really two reasons for that. The first one is the state of regulation. If you're a drone manufacturer in the United States, you're primarily concerned about the regulations coming out of the Department of Transportation, FAA. If you're a crypto founder in the United States, I'm sure I'm going to miss some on this list, you have to worry about the regulations and the enforcement arms of the SEC, the CFTC, certainly all the branches that Juan used to work with at Treasury, including OFAC and FinCEN and IRS, the consumer safety agencies, the national security agencies, and the law enforcement agencies. And that's just at the federal level. You also have 50 state attorneys general or other folks who run the money services business regulatory regime in each of the states. When you look at that, say, wow, this is a lot of regulation. I just want to build this great product. And it's the fact that we have this system of, some agencies that are within the executive branch, some agencies that are in the executive branch but are independent, each with their own missions that cause the regulatory scheme, even just on the federal level in the United States, to be sort of a hash and to be fraught with risk. So you have people who don't want to engage in illegal, illicit behavior, who are building because the technology is super interesting, and you have a regulatory scheme that could put them at risk anyway. And the second prong of that is that consumers, especially technology consumers, don't tend to be, I want to be sensitive about this, super discerning in the product that they use and its relationship to the ownership of their data and the privacy of their data. Many of you in this room, I'm sure, have read the story on TikTok over the past few days. Mm-hmm. U.S. management of TikTok discussing how hard it is to have Beijing stay out of their data streams for U.S. users. Beijing is not a big fan of crypto because in the way that we've described it, the Bitcoin network is out of their control. But what are they a big fan of? Hoovering up data about everyone in the world, especially in the United States. And what we see on the horizon, actually it's not on the horizon, it's here now, are products like WeChat Pay and Alipay that come out of China big tech that are completely aligned in the same way that TikTok is with the party. And to go back to the point about sort of consumer discernment, if that product wins, if that does what those Gen Zers and millennials want it to do, like let's split a check, I'm just going to shoot you some money, then the financial sort of espionage apparatus of Beijing has grown exponentially, and we've lost the initiative because these products are not being developed in the United States. One more point. I think the other reason that we should be super interested in this is that crypto has the ability to fulfill some of the promise of the internet. I mean, way back when, in the early days of the internet, like, well, you can't have commercial behavior on the internet, and you know, it was a system that developed over time through standards and protocol development. But the idea was to have people interact over the network. It was, you know, to use a word you've heard before, you know, it could have been a decentralized internet. We engaged in re-centralization, you know, with the Facebooks, the Twitters, the you know, other financial institutions gather names, addresses, passwords, financial information, photographs, you know, all of the things that we now share on online have been re-centralized onto these platforms. And you know, when I was counseling companies on cybersecurity, the advice that I give, and sort of my lament as a consumer, is companies collect a lot of information that makes them targets for that kind of espionage that I was describing before. Crypto allows users to verify who they are and to verify attributes that they have that might allow them to interact on a particular network without actually sharing that information. Through cryptography, the verification can happen that I am, you know, I wish, an accredited investor, or I am someone who lives in a country that is not comprehensively sanctioned by the United States. And therefore, I could interact on this permissionless network. And that brings down the number of targets that our adversaries can sort of probe our US companies for. So this opens a question, and I think this is one of the questions that my co-panelists will talk about, which is we have a regulatory choice to make. You know, our financial intelligence / surveillance regime in the United States under the Bank Secrecy Act has relied on intermediaries, right? I don't have to, well, I do on my taxes, but I don't have to report transactions. It's the bank that has to report the transaction. If you move from, if you use this magic that we've described to create peer-to-peer exchange of value, and there is no intermediary, then what do we do as a public policy matter? We've seen the first moves at the end of the Trump administration around something that I call, they wouldn't call it this, but re-centralization. That is, we want to take the ability of people to engage in peer-to-peer transactions and diminish it. We want to make sure that Coinbase, to use the example that Juan used before, where you can buy your crypto, is not sending, is not allowing its users to take that crypto off and use it on MetaMask, which is something that you own. There is no intermediary there. Re-centralization, I think, would dampen the ability for this technology to do some of the world-changing things that we see around the corner. So what I've been advocating for, and something that I'm sure we'll be talking about during the panel, is we should lean into those attributes of cryptocurrency, especially the transparency, the lack of anonymity, and the pseudonymity. Did I get that one?
I think so.
And rather than trying to bring things back into a centralized system to accomplish the goals of the United States, which are to police, enforce against money laundering, terrorism finance, and the like. I'll leave it at that.
Well, thanks, Gus. I think that you did a perfect job in setting up the two big questions we're going to talk about here, and I'll loosely characterize them. And there's obviously a lot of particular detail under each of these umbrellas, so to speak. But the first one is the choice between public and private, centralization and decentralization. And let's turn to, we'll start with Una, and then Bill can talk a little bit about the tension potentially between central bank, digital currencies, stable coins, and the policy. And then you also teed up the question on monitoring and ability to use currency, dollar transactions, banking presence across the globe, the dollar as a currency of international trade, to monitor transactions, get data about them, and extend U.S. jurisdiction to enforce. And we'll turn to Juan for that question. All right, so Una, I'll go ahead and start with you.
Yes, decentralization. Well, of course, in some cases that already exists. I mean, you can have peer-to-peer lending, peer-to-peer transactions using technology. Those systems are established. I'm frankly always concerned about peer-to-peer because who do I chase if something goes wrong and my money has disappeared? And actually, if you look at the history of from Bitcoin onwards, or what you find a history of is money losses, manipulation, theft at every turn. So I think it's all very well talking about transparency and decentralization, but you do have to hold someone accountable for the way in which those transactions are carried out. And if you are only dealing with someone at the other side of the world about whom you know nothing, or, and we have seen this too often with the use of Facebook, for example, of an identity which is not their own at all. Dating ones, not that I dream of using them, are noteworthy in that respect. You know, a 25-year-old woman thinks she's going to meet a 27-year-old man, and instead some 60-year-old turns up. Not quite what his picture on the internet showed. So we do have serious issues here of accountability. And if you are offering services to the public, then you must be accountable for the nature of those services that you offer. Now, I want to make a couple of quick points. I'll try and make them quickly. First of all, I think we must be very careful to separate technological developments from crypto coins and stable coins. Those are not interchangeably linked. Quick example here. Hong Kong had a major disaster when a trading company went round all the major banks in Hong Kong and borrowed money for trade finance from each of those banks. Okay, Hong Kong developed a project in which it linked all of those banks on a blockchain so that if you were looking for trade finance and you'd already borrowed money from Bank A, Banks B, C, and D knew that you had done that and therefore didn't replicate the loan. So that is a use of blockchain, which is a sensible, in my view, a sensible use, and they were busy developing that project. So technology, this developing technology, I think we need to look at this, and I'm very interested in developing such technology, FinReg, and what the Fed calls FinSup, using technology for supervision. Yes, that should definitely be one of the ways in which technology should be used, and there may be many other applications that I haven't thought of. Third point about regulation here, in particular, regulation has always been totally badly structured in the US. I couldn't believe it when I started interviewing and talking to people about technology, that first of all, one set of regulators sent their bank examiners in for 6 months, and as soon as they left, the state bank examiners showed up for the next 6 months, allegedly in the head office. So I learned some interesting stories about the location of the offices for bank examiners in relation to the head office. So uses of technology there, I think, are very important. So it's not a question of being anti-new developments. Thirdly, you do have a problem with the structure of regulation, a serious problem here, and I don't know how that can be resolved. But also you are behind on regulation, and although it hasn't come into force yet, there's an issue around NFTs to be settled, which France introduced at the last moment, and that's the market in crypto assets. And it's worth reading that legislation, which is comprehensive, but of course is dealing with fewer entities. So America is still the executive order to report from each agency by September the 5th. When will regulation follow from that by the time all the agencies have to agree on it, even if they agree with each other's offering on that? So a real problem with regulation here. And growing interest in crypto, it's very hard to avoid crypto. It pops up on your computer the whole time when you're looking at something else. You see it in advertisements. What we shouldn't underestimate, and it's the fear of missing out, particularly for younger people who seem to wish to invest in virtual assets, including real estate, when some point their parents are going to chuck them out of the basement and they'll wish that they invested in real estate assets in which they could actually live instead of virtual assets. But don't underestimate the power of fashion. And I'll just make a quick last point. Why are governments concerned with this? Partly because of the point I've just made, but partly because they see it, and I would say correctly so, to the issue and management of fiat currency. And I will pause there because others need to.
Yeah, absolutely. And before we turn to Juan on some of the questions of financial crime detection, et cetera, Bill, maybe just a word sort of building on what Una said about the tension between a central bank digital currency and stablecoin or other digital currencies.
I don't think there's any inherent tension as long as the central bank digital currency doesn't declare monopoly in a particular jurisdiction. So the U.S. could have both a central bank digital currency, effectively having using blockchain rails to introducing an official U.S. dollar on blockchain rails. You could also have a public market of money tethered to the dollar. And you could either do that by literally taking $1 and digitizing it by handing back a token. You can have a basket, some say that looks very much like a money market sort of structure. And then you have the more exotic stablecoin variety, algorithmic variety, which is very much in experiment mode right now. But these two things can exist side by side. Or you can just, as some members of Congress have suggested, forego a CBDC altogether and rely on the private sector to, as the market dictates, digitize dollars so they can be used on these blockchain rails and these new ecosystems which are being developed. What you can't do with stablecoins, which you can do with a CBDC, is make it a dystopian panopticon, which is certainly what China seeks to do. China wants their own CBDC for two reasons. One, they want to be able to not only surveil all commercial activity in their jurisdiction, but they also want to incentivize is the wrong word, mandate certain activity. So if you don't use your dollars, if you don't use your yuan and your digital wallet by a certain time period for certain things, they disappear. And I think the president of the Bank of International Settlements, in quite Machiavellian fashion, was pontificating about the ability for us to implement policy through CBDC by saying we can encourage spending by saying if you don't spend your money, the money will disappear in your wallet. That is a horrifying thought. The United States, to the extent it, and I have faith in this, tremendous faith in this, that in the United States at the very least, can't say anything about Europe or the UK where they have, let's say, less fealty to notions of absolute autonomy and freedom that we do in the United States, that we will not choose a road which would beget a CBDC, which is first monopolistic, and second, a surveillance tool, and third, a tool to restrict commercial freedom. I think the horrors of all of that are so plain they don't need to be expanded upon, and I think notwithstanding the senselessness of a lot of political debate, I don't think this topic would be one where you'd hear many senseless voices. I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Bill. All right, Juan, well, we're going to turn it to you to close out our panel discussion before audience questions, and I think you know the topic, so I'll just turn it over to you.
All right, I'll be quick and efficient, but just one final point off of what my fellow panelists have said. I think in many ways we've crossed the Rubicon of legitimacy with the crypto economy, although we've seen the effects of the euphoria, right? And we're now braving the crypto winter along with the bear market, so you're getting sort of the winnowing of and the maturity of the space. But I do think, especially with the executive order that Una mentioned that President Biden signed, there was a clear recognition by the U.S. government that the technology is here to stay. We have to understand how we manage the risks, how we see the opportunities, and then, as Gus was saying, how we actually compete internationally, especially with China, in the payment domain and in the digital asset domain. So I just want to make that point because I do think it's important to recognize, and I've watched the space evolve over time where it was a little cottage industry, then people thought I had three horns on my head because everything they saw was Mt. Gox and fraud cases and Silk Road case and Liberty Reserve and all the worst elements of criminal actors leveraging this technology to the kind of euphoria we've seen over the last year and a half, 2 years. So there's been this evolution, which then explains sort of how people think about the risks, because I think much of the experience and the touch points with the technology has been really around how do you think about fraud risks, how do you think about illicit finance risk, and then the national security risks tied to that, and they're real. You know, I'm a crypto enthusiast, but with great caution and with eyes wide open, because this is a new domain of financial and economic and commercial interaction. That means bad actors are going to be in that space. That means bad actors are going to try to leverage it. They're going to try to take advantage. They're going to try to engage in arbitrage off of where, you know, regulators aren't paying attention, et cetera. And by the way, a footnote, Una, I'm excited to hear that Binance is going to open in Europe because I'd love to see how they're going to operate under the GDPR rules, because I think entities that are based in China have gotten a free pass on questions of data privacy and security when that debate has been largely a transatlantic debate. But in any event, the challenges are real. And you've seen the U.S. government in particular over the last year and a half focus on ransomware as a key national security issue. We saw the Colonial Pipeline case and other cases where it's clear that ransomware isn't just a criminal tool of profit, and crypto isn't just used as an easy way of making payments in that ransomware context, but it actually puts key systems and infrastructure at risk. You have currently in Costa Rica the Conti group having taken over the government websites and services, and they, in essence, are holding a country hostage, a government hostage, where people can't pay their taxes online, government employees can't get paid, the government has declared a national emergency. This is all ransomware, right? And the government refuses to pay. But so ransomware has become a bigger feature and a highlight of how crypto, in some ways, enables bad actors to interact. You had focus on North Korea as a rogue actor that has always been a mafia state, as we've said, but has really begun to innovate how to use cyber heists and ransomware. There's a new book out called The Lazarus Effect, talking about what the North Koreans are doing in this space. And they are sort of a principal case study of a rogue state actor that's trying to take advantage of this technology to circumvent sanctions and to get access to capital that they can't get access to, even through the banks in China, because we've put so much pressure and scrutiny on the formal financial system and the North Korean touch points there. You also have, in the Russia context, a lot of questions and concerns as to whether or not the oligarchs or even state-owned enterprises can evade sanctions or engage in money laundering by diverting assets into the crypto domain. And so there's not a lot of evidence of that. Certainly very hard to do at scale, but a lot of actors, including the private sector, Coinbase, for example, shut down a number of Russian-based accounts because of concerns around some of those suspicions. So there's a constant concern around the systemic money laundering risks that are attached to this. And then finally, going back to Gus's earlier point about the challenge with China, there is a risk, and we've written about this before in terms of an alliance of financial rogues, if you will, figuring out how not just to sort of launch their own digital currency like the digital yuan, or not just evading sanctions or money laundering controls, but actually connecting their rails, connecting their payment systems in ways that allow them to operate outside the gaze and bounds of the current financial system, all of the controls that are attendant to it, and the type of transparency that I think we all hope and want the technology to serve. But this technology and the payment rails serving those rogue actors. So it wouldn't be just that the Russians might use crypto, it's that they might use crypto in concert with the Chinese or with the Belarusians or the Venezuelans or the Iranians to evade the broader sanctions regime and protocols that are in place to control rogue activity in the financial system. And so that's a sort of a sketch, a bit of a panoply of where those risks sit with all sorts of nuance attached to it. But these are risks that have always been a focus, I think, for policymakers and regulators ab initio. I think now that we've crossed the sort of the Rubicon of legitimacy, everyone's excited about the opportunities and sort of returning back to, okay, well, how then do we manage these risks in a decentralized environment? And just to put a kind of a final bow on the decentralization, centralization question, I do think there's inherent tension in the system around the way we typically regulate, whether it's for consumer fraud, systemic risk, or for illicit finance, the financial and commercial system, which tends to be around centralized nodes or exchanges. Even though there are peer-to-peer capabilities, at scale, Western economies have driven their regulation through commercial banks, broker-dealers, exchanges, and the onus of knowing their customers, understanding the nature of transactions, the accountability and traceability that comes with it has largely fallen on those central actors. And in some ways, the crypto economy is trended in that way. So the big players like Coinbase are centralized actors, right? They are market makers for what tokens get traded. They're the ones you go to exchange things. Circle issues USDC. That's very much kind of a centralized player in a decentralized environment. But there is this tug and pull, and now you have over 100 countries either piloting or experimenting with CBDCs, central bank digital currencies, to include the US. And a key question here is, what does this look like? Is this going to be a system and a technology that gets more and more co-opted by central governments, which is what China's trying to do, which is what the Bank of International Settlements has now suggested in light of current economic crisis should happen? Or do you have a bit more of an open market, which has been the U.S. model with the U.S. dollar backing stable coins, for example? And a final point, and this runs counter to the point I made in my book many years ago, because I was worried about cryptocurrencies challenging dollar dominance. the role of the dollar as the chief reserve currency, chief trading currency, adds enormous power to the ability of the U.S. to affect what happens in the financial system globally, right? That's the essence of what we did post 9/11 to try to attack illicit actors in the space. And I worried about crypto serving as an alternate or diminishing the value of the dollar. I actually think now that the dollar actually can be strengthened and is being strengthened in the current environment, because the legitimate actors, those that build trust, are those that are going to be able to tie their assets to dollars and to be able to assure users and the broader financial system that they're actually tied to a legitimate and trustworthy system. And this is where I think China fails. There was an op-ed in the FT, I think yesterday, or I read it late last night, so it may have appeared this morning in the print edition, that talks about why China has not become a dominant player in the financial domain. They're a big economic player, but why is the yuan not achieving greater parity with the dollar? Why is it not following the pattern of the pound when the British Empire was at its nadir? A major reason is the lack of trust. And that is only exacerbated by what China's been doing. And it's only exacerbated by the crypto winter and the bear market, where everyone is giving this arena greater and greater scrutiny. So I think this is an arena where the U.S. can win and can challenge, but it depends on how we view the technology and how the regulations unfold.
Great. Well, thanks to all of our panelists. This has been a really educational and very interesting discussion. Now we'd like to hear from you. Any questions in the audience? I don't think we have a mic. I will repeat the question. Oh, we do have a mic. Here we go. And the first is this gentleman in the Stanford sweater.
Hello. Just pushing the top. No.
There you go.
There you go.
Hello. Hello. Hey, everyone. Thank you so much. My name is Omar. I'm from the National Security Task Force at the Hoover Institute at Stanford University, and on the FedSoc board over there as a non-law student. So this has been a very interesting conversation. And my question is through the lens of the great power competition. Juan, you set the stage perfectly for my question. So with the greater isolation of Russia in the financial world, I want to see if y'all be bold enough to make some predictions of what crypto's role is going to be in this new world order. We're going to see a greater isolation on behalf of Russia maybe. And then what you see happening with the evolution of quantum technology, quantum computing, and the world of crypto. There have been a lot of predictions out there, and I'd love to see what y'all think about it. Thank you.
I'm really, Omar, great questions. Really happy to take both. I've said to the press, so I'm happy to sort of predict with you because I've already said it. If we were facing the Russia crisis 5 years from now, we would be in more trouble in terms of the Russian economy, Russian actors, and third parties leveraging crypto to break the isolation, right? That is attempting to grow. Now, the isolation of Russia is highly limited given the oil and gas trade and certainly the gas and infrastructure dependencies in Europe. So that is going to be an inherent problem and, frankly, sword and shield for the Russians in terms of any attempt to isolate them. But crypto currently is not really an asset class that the Russians can look to, and as I said, at scale or volume to replace systemically their ability to operate on the SWIFT system or to get back their $600+ billion of reserves that had been frozen, or to do all the other things that they need to do to operate long-term and legitimately in the financial and commercial system. I do think there's going to be, over time, the legitimate banking centers and economies of the world, as we've seen them unify around Russia. I think they're also going to unify around how to think about leveraging crypto. So I think the G7 economies and the central banks have been talking about this more. I think the IFIs and the development banks have been talking about this. I think there's going to be more and more harmony over time for the legitimate banking centers and economies to actually leverage crypto in a way that then continues to try to isolate rogue activity, even in the crypto domain. On quantum, just very quickly, for a number of years I sat on the board of a quantum computing company called Cambridge Quantum Computing, which merged with Honeywell to form Quantinium. I think quantum computing is upon us. One of my warnings to folks in the crypto industry is, yes, it's secure. Yes, the federation of the network is a hedge against all of the security implications that we worry about from a cyber perspective or a manipulation perspective. But quantum computing will challenge that fundamentally, and it will challenge it sooner rather than later. The company I was associated with now has verifiable quantum encryption keys known as quantum origin out in the market. We know that nation states are investing in this space quite aggressively. And we also know that quantum encryption and quantum computing can hack current encryption as well as past encryption. So if you think about the problem of all the data that the Chinese are hoovering up, even if they can't access it now, they will be able to access it with quantum cracking tools in the future. And so that's why I think sooner rather than later we have to open our eyes very quickly to the quantum implications in the crypto domain, but also more broadly.
Great.
Eric, just one very, very quick point. I think this is an opportunity for the U.S. We've talked about the opportunities and challenges in the U.S. around regulation, but I think back to the mission of my old agency, DHS, which was designed and is the nexus between the private sector and the public sector in sort of intelligence sharing and analysis. And one of the great successes of DHS has been establishing ISACs, information sharing and analysis centers for each of the critical infrastructure sectors in the United States, including financial services. Given the maturity of this area and the threats that Juan just laid out and that you talked about in your question, especially quantum computing, but also cyber attacks, sophisticated nation states, hacking crypto systems in order to evade international sanctions, it makes some sense as part of the President Biden's EO process to think about whether a crypto ISAC would make sense. The government is going to have a lot of information that the private sector doesn't have, and the private sector is going to have a lot of information that the government doesn't have, and bridging that divide will help to safeguard the assets of United States persons who are on these chains.
Great. Next question, gentleman back, I think, with the tie, hand up.
I'm Peter Humphrey, an intelligence analyst and a former diplomat. China keeps making us promises on the environmental front, and their deadlines are always conveniently just past the death of most of the party members who make the promises. One of those promises, of course, is to control the use of fossil fuels, and yet every month there's another small plant being built in China to burn more fossil fuels. Realizing this, that crypto mining would mean even more fossil fuel plants, they gave the boot to the enterprise, some of which recrystallized into Texas and Oklahoma. Mm-hmm. I don't see this as a sustainable approach to human dynamics. I gotta ask, what is the industry take on the inherent waste of energy at a time when you're trying to control your energy waste to create fake money?
Okay. Oh, well, we'll turn to Bill, I think, for this.
It's a loaded question. It's fake money, guys. It's worthless. So a couple things. One, China didn't ban Bitcoin mining because it was bad for the climate. Maybe that was more than just a whitewashed excuse, but I wouldn't take that seriously. Secondly, there are a number of ways for these networks to work, one of which is through proof of work mining, which requires computers that are hyper specialized to burn a lot of energy, solving these math problems to get to win the race to print an X block. Bitcoin and Ethereum run on proof of work right now. The concern is that this is very energy intensive. Point one, Ethereum this year will be moving to proof of stake, where its energy draw by most estimates will drop by 99.85%. Turning, if you could imagine the Burj Khalifa being a massive energy, the entire Ethereum network will go down to the size of a thimble. Secondly, Bitcoin has, and I'm not one of these Bitcoin climate defender guys, so I'm going to riff here. But as I understand the argument goes, firstly, the race is for cheaper energy. And so if there's a green, renewable, cheaper source of energy, Bitcoin miners go there and leverage it. That's why you find a lot of Bitcoin miners looking at places where there's geothermal. It's free. You just build your equipment on top of it. It's a lot cheaper. It encourages you to find cheaper renewable sources where you're not so exposed to petroleum market prices. Second, the fact that Bitcoin miners use energy is actually a good thing if you care about like people getting electricity. In Texas, for example, they built up Bitcoin mining, and the utility of it is in the winter when it gets really cold and the electrical grid can't otherwise support all of the heaters turned on. The Bitcoin miners, through some sort of agreement with the state, predicated on their existence there is predicated on. They turn off their miners. There's more capacity in the grid so people don't freeze to death. Maybe you care about the environment more than people freezing to death. That's your call. Thirdly, there's an argument to be made, and I think a good one, that notwithstanding the use of fossil fuels to propagate any one of these proof-of-work networks, having a independent, trustable network that is peer-to-peer and either serves as a store of value or medium of exchange or something that is global and accessible, has its flaws now, but hopefully it improves. That is worth the price of whatever energy you're burning. And so if you say, no, absolutely not, it's fake, it's useless, then of course it's not worth the price. But a lot of people disagree. A lot of people think it's very important that it either will be the new trust foundation or that it'll be a check on the caprice of government today. So if you value that, then yes, spending the money on the petroleum energy is worthwhile.
I know, Una, you wanted to say something. I'll take another question after that.
Yes, a couple of things. First of all, I think it's important to distinguish between Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies or crypto assets, as I would prefer to call them. So I would separate Bitcoin, which I really don't think has a future as a currency, global or otherwise. Secondly, of course, China was engaging in what is now called greenwashing, and was certainly not the reason. What China wishes to do with its own central bank digital currency is actually to control the behaviours of its citizens, so that if your behaviour is not regarded as ideologically correct, then, for example, you won't be able to book, and currently you can't book a place on a high-speed train, or you'll find it very difficult to get a flight out of China. So it was only greenwashing in the first place. In the second place, their CBDC is designed to control the activities of its citizens, and that is, in my view, the prime purpose of it, and perhaps even more important than seeking to become another reserve currency. Secondly, or whatever point it was, the last point I want to make here is just to remind everybody that wind and solar cannot provide in any form currently a continuous supply of electricity. It is just not possible to do that. Batteries, they're not there yet. Use of hydrogen, unlikely, tends to blow up, not transportable easily. So there's no other source of a continuous supply of electricity, which is not only necessary for the maintenance of an internet system, but for many other things beside, and we need to bear that in mind. Unless, of course, you go for nuclear power, but this is unpopular in many quarters.
So we have 3 questions. Let's try to take all 3 and then an answer. So tan jacket behind you, and then up front, and then up front.
Hello, I'm Carl Peterson. I work for the Charter Cities Institute. I'm a lawyer there. My first question I'd like to direct at the panel sort of briefly. If your cryptocurrency cannot be used to evade sanctions and buy drugs on the internet, is it really a cryptocurrency? My second question then, I'd like to direct specifically at Mr. Hughes. You sort of mentioned regarding central bank digital currencies, and I think Dr. McDonald has touched on this as well, that these CBDCs can be programmed for different purchases. They could be programmed so that they stop use after a certain amount of time, so to spend it in X amount of time. In light, I guess, and Mr. Hughes, you briefly said that you were confident, based on America's culture, that we wouldn't have to worry about that. But in light of the Obama administration's Operation Choke Point, where the DOJ pressured different credit card processing companies to not process credit card transactions for things like arms manufacturers or internet porn, do you not think that maybe after 10 years or so of the U.S. using a CBDC that maybe you couldn't buy a firearm with it, or maybe meat, or a Fed stock membership? Thank you.
Were you going to get all of them?
No, go ahead. Do you want to respond to that one?
I'll respond to the first one. The answer is you are correct. It's not a cryptocurrency because cryptocurrency is permissionless. Most people use it for illicit purposes. There is illicit purposes it's used for, just like the United States dollar. With respect to your CBDC question, my presumption is that to the extent one is created in this country, the legislation would be such that it would need to be, certain uses would be permitted and other programming functionality would be explicitly excluded. And so this is where we start to see the value of something that's on-chain and transparent. You wouldn't be able to exclude certain uses without that functionality expressing itself in the blockchain for anyone to see, and everybody would be looking. And so, unlike a executive agency surreptitiously leaning on private businesses to engage in certain activity which nobody can, which is inconspicuous until perhaps after the fact, to introduce that functionality, you would need to do so in the open, and my expectation would be that federal statute would preclude you from doing that. And if it did not, then the CBDC in this country is an abomination. Restraint has to be written into any legislation. That's what I have to say about that.
Juan, did you want to say anything?
Yeah, I'll be very quick. It's a great question about criminal use, because criminals have had the same problems of adoption, convertibility, and consistency of value that anybody touching crypto does. So in looking at how criminal actors have used it, right, there have been these pockets in these exchanges and these markets. And what's really interesting is you start to look at the data and the flows, there are these concentrations of risk in the crypto economy and concentrations of types of crypto that are being used. So for example, we've seen and we've looked at Hamas and Hezbollah flirting with the use of privacy coins. Not necessarily Bitcoin, but using things like Monero and others that they can hide their hand in, and using particular exchanges. There's been recent reporting about Binance being an exchange that is a bit more open to criminal activity. So I think what we're going to see is more and more concentrations of risk that then allows you to say, okay, this is how this crypto is being used and not this one.
Go ahead, Una. And then could we get the question from the lady in the green in the center?
Yes, first a couple of comments about CBDC. all the major economies have been considering the introduction of CBDC now for some long time. Some have launched projects to examine the possibility, done a great deal of research on this, but no major economy has yet adopted CBDC, because they're not only the issues which have already been mentioned by Bill here, and I agree with that, but there's also the issue of the relationship between money and the economy and the commercial banks. That if CBDC becomes the dominant, issued by the central bank alone, becomes the dominant currency, then you can undermine the commercial banks. And depending on the structure, you could, just as an ordinary person, if it ends up with retail accounts held by the central bank, what fun it would be to go to some bureaucrat in the retail bank and try to get investment in an innovative startup. I'll leave you to reflect on that.
All right, thanks. Penultimate question here, and then we'll come up front for the last question.
Okay, thank you. My name is Bonnie Wachtel. I work in the investment business. I'll address this to Una because I'm something of a Bitcoin skeptic, and I think you and I are the most in line that way. First, in terms of the use case, I'm quite concerned that among the general public, the understanding of what cryptocurrency is vastly at odds with the reality in terms of how this is being marketed to generate interest. For U.S. consumers that have lots of access to bank accounts and credit cards, I don't see any reason to be relying on this or having any desire to be holding their balance in these coins. And I'd have to say, for most of the people that I know, they have exactly one interest in this, and that is as a speculative asset. It's something you buy at 10 and hope that it's going to go to 20 in the not too distant future. It's sort of greater fool theory. Now, I pair that with a deep understanding that I have in terms of the regulatory aspect of investments in this country, and I think Mr. Sandy, you're being kind of polite in saying that there is a embedded tension. It's completely at odds. I mean, any idea of transparency is the exact opposite of what regulators are trying to do, which is to go through entity layers to find actual ownership, and there hasn't been any mention of tax evasion. Of course, if you've got to have a social security number attached to any transaction in Bitcoin, then obviously transparency has very little to do with what's going on. Putting all of that together and comment on any of it that you would like to, is there no appetite whatsoever from anyone on the panel to just try to slow this down, shut it off, make it use, I'm not talking about the information cases between corporations that are going to discuss regarding the blockchain, but as a currency, just try with international cooperation to turn back the clock before it becomes impossible to do so.
Well, very quickly, since you directed that to me, thank you. I think a total transparency of the kind I described in relation to smart stable coins, I think will go a very long way. Then, of course, I talked about being constantly surrounded and, of course, people taking confirmation about the validity of such investments from celebs, which in the UK is being considered. I don't think a decision has been reached. We can use our Advertising Standards Authority to look at the validity of advertisements, the truthfulness of advertisements, and the consideration is being given by the FCA to ban celebrities who rake in a nice lot of money from appearing to propose and recommend people to invest in this, that, or the other. But once again, never underestimate the power of FOMO. I am astonished at how much people feel, oh, I'm going to be left out. And surveys showed that's what they feel. I'm going to be left out if I don't invest in this. The governor of the Bank of England said the slogan should be prepared to lose all your money.
Eric, one sentence. I know we're nearing the end. And I just wanted to respond to the point that you made about, oh, now it's left my brain. Okay, next question.
Well, I was gonna say it was actually interesting, the fear of missing out, and combining that with the statistic that you mentioned earlier, Gus, that it's only like 15% of Americans who are actually invested in any of this. So long way to go to get everybody in there.
And FOMO's everywhere. It's everywhere.
All right.
Okay, I'm sorry, it came back.
Okay.
So we've been talking about the potential for Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies to affect the monetary policy of the United States. And your point of why would I or any of my friends use this is correct. We are blessed to live in a country where there's a robust financial system that generally, with some exclusions that we've been talking about today, serves its customers. The monetary policy of Venezuela is different. The monetary policy of China, as we've discussed, is different. And there are countries around the world where repressive regimes will use their influence over their currency to affect confiscatory policies or otherwise use social engineering, provide devaluing of the currency through their own policies. In those countries, having the ability to have at least some of your wealth on an immutable blockchain with only a seed phrase of 12 or 24 words that could be kept in your brain if you worry about crossing over a border and having it on a piece of paper, as Una suggested, is very, very powerful.
Right. All right, great. So one last question up front here, and then thanks for your indulgence. We've extended the panel a little bit, but we're not going to intrude into the lunch hour. Go ahead.
I'll be very quick. Excuse me. I'm Paul Bragner. I'm head of the policy and advocacy at Electric Coin Company. We're the developers of Zcash. And we are pioneers in zero-knowledge proof technology. It's kind of been alluded to in the panel today, in that the cryptography that helped make Bitcoin has evolved since 2008 and 2009. There are new capabilities there that allow you to have enhanced privacy, where you in fact have complete anonymity on the blockchain. And I've been in technology policy for a long time, and I think I've seen over the history of internet that you've had debates over cryptography, whether that was a good thing or bad thing, whether governments needed a backdoor. I think over all of that history, we've pretty much come to the conclusion that encryption and privacy on the internet is important. It helped us develop commerce on the internet, moving from HTTP to HTTPS. We have end-to-end encryption in our video conferences, in our chats, and we build privacy into the blockchain on Zcash in order to promote freedom and to push back against totalitarian and authoritarian governments, and to allow people to have true digital cash. So have we learned our lessons from the internet, and are we going to have this debate again about whether or not it's important to have end-to-end encryption in our finances on the blockchain?
Juan, you're perfect for this.
Yeah, I think there is, and I won't be as polite here, maybe. There is real tension with the fundamentals of transparency, accountability, traceability, which is at the heart of at least the anti-money laundering system in the US and globally, and end-to-end encryption and some of the privacy coins and other technologies that are evolving. That said, there are elements of the technologies that allow you to begin to think about transparency and exposure differently, and allow you to think about getting to beneficial ownership and counterparty risk management. And all of that actually has to be part of the next evolution. And you see authorities doing precisely that. Regulators trying to think about how do you trace and manage risk in this domain. Law enforcement actually, identifying wallet holders and going after it. Half of the colonial pipeline or most of it The ransom payment was clawed back. And so I think there's this deep tension around how much transparency is enough transparency, what does security and privacy mean, and that goes well beyond the crypto domain. That's going to the heart of our challenge with data and how we expose our lives and our interactions.
Anyone else on that one? Panel? No? All right, great. Well, thanks everybody so much. We really had a great time up here with you, and I hope you enjoyed it too. The plan for the rest of the afternoon is we are now going to break for lunch. There's a lunch right outside the doors here that you can grab and take back to the tables here. We have about an hour and a half, but at 1:30 sharp, we're going to resume with the second panel. So until 1:30, if you have other things to do, in addition to the lunch, feel free to leave the room, but please do come back at 1:30. Thank you.
Please do.
Thanks, Matt.